Break Fix's History of Motorsport series is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center, as well as the Society of Automotive Historians, the Watkins Glen Area Chamber of Commerce, and the Argetsinger family.
Seatbelts belatedly come to Formula One by Preston Lerner. For the past half century, the FIA has been the principal driver behind efforts to make racing safer. It wasn't always so. Although the SCCA required seatbelts in 1957, the FIA didn't follow suit until 1972. From the dawn of road racing, conventional wisdom held that drivers should jump out of the cockpit when a crash was imminent, a technique perfected by Maston Gregory. This myth was conclusively exploded by a largely forgotten British physician by the name of Michael Henderson, who conducted crash investigations for the RAF. In 1968, Henderson, who moonlighted as a club racer and freelance journalist, wrote Motor Racing in Safety, the foundational text on this subject. At the same time, he fitted his own race cars with 4-point harnesses, augmented with an anti-submarine strap inspired by a parachute design. This put him in touch with Terence Dumbo Willans, a record-setting parachutist who tested ejection seats for the RAF. Willans later went into business with another club racer, John Fenning. By 1969, 6-point Willans harnesses were found in almost every car on the F1 grid. The battle for seatbelts had been won almost before it started. Preston Lerner is a freelance writer who has covered racing and many other subjects for the past 4 decades. For many years, he was a regular contributor to Automobile Magazine and Road and Track. Mr. Lerner is also the author and co-author of 6 books, most recently Shelby American, The Renegades Who Built the Cars, Won the Races, and Lived the Legend. The material used in television turns its gaze on motorsports is drawn from his upcoming book, The Deadliest Decade, which will examine the safety, commercial, and technological developments that transformed racing from 1964 to 1973.
So today I will be speaking about how Formula One finally, belatedly, accepted seatbelts. You may find this hard to believe considering the status of Formula One these days, but seatbelts were not commonplace in Formula One until the late 1960s. They weren't required until 1972. This is long after they were standard equipment here in the United States. This is A.J. Foyt in a dirt champ car in 1964. And you can see pretty clearly here that he's wearing shoulder harnesses. And in fact, in 1968, seatbelts were required in all American passenger cars, yet they were not in almost any Formula One cars at the time. And there's a strange story behind this, which I'm going to tell here today. I think most people would agree that these days, Formula One is considered the pinnacle of motorsports. It's the most expensive form of racing. It uses the most exotic technology, and it has, I think, the most enviable safety record. Since 1994, only one driver has been killed in a Formula One race, and this is largely because of the safety protocols and technology that the FIA has adopted, and they deserve a lot of credit for making racing an incredibly safe sport. This was not always the case. If you go back to the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, Formula One cars were among the most lethal vehicles on the planet. Emerson Fittipaldi once told me, one time I had a 1 in 3 chance of dying. Emerson was a 2-time world champion, 2-time IndyCar champion, Indy 500 winner, very charismatic figure. When he told me this, I thought he was exaggerating, to be honest, but I went back and looked at the records, and in his 4th Formula One race at Monza in 1970, 27 drivers participated in practice. 9 of them later died in race cars. Now, it's true they didn't all die in Formula One cars, but if you look at the years 1964 to 1973, and that's the period that I'm studying, 10 drivers died in Formula One races in that 10-year period. So a pretty appalling safety record. Some of you may recall Peter Bryant, best known for designing and building Can-Am cars, but earlier in his career, he worked, this is in the mid-60s, worked on Formula One cars and worked in Indy cars. And of that experience, he said, compared with the contemporary Indy cars, the F1 cars were death traps. Bobby Unter, 3-time IndyCar champion, Indy 500 winner, that is, was even more scathing in his assessment. Based on his experience driving a VRM in the Canadian Grand Prix in 1968, he said, in those days, Formula One was way behind IndyCar racing, way behind. Their technologies weren't up with ours. Safety was, I venture to say, 10 years behind in those days. They used to kill drivers like popcorn. Uncle Bobby had a unique turn of phrase, I would say. There were a couple of factors at play here. The most obvious and probably most important was technology. 1966, Formula One regulations changed from a maximum of 1.5 liters to 3 liters, so engines doubled in size and speeds went up I don't know, 30, 40 miles an hour. This is also the period when wings and downforce first appear. There was also a tire war going on between Firestone, Goodyear, and Dunlop. During war, that's when technology advances exponentially. So it was with tires. Tires became much wider, they became lower profile, they were much stickier. This is when the slick tire, the treadless tire, was invented, at least for road racing. So cornering speeds went up dramatically, and corners are, of course, where the most serious accidents occur. And you have to remember that in this period, the road courses in Europe were largely just that. They were road courses. Runoff areas had things like trees and telephone poles, sometimes farmhouses and barns. I mean, things you did not want to hit at high speed. And when you did hit them, the results were often fatal. Second factor in explaining this appalling safety record was the attitudes of the era. Yes, when a driver was killed, there was naturally a period of mourning and grief, but the general consensus at the time was this came with the territory, and it was sort of the cost of doing business. You have to remember that 1960s were only one generation removed from World War II, a global conflict in which something like 50 million people died, many of them civilians. So when a young man who was doing something voluntarily without a gun being put to his head, doing something, in fact, that a lot of the fans wish they were doing themselves, when he was killed in a race car, yes, people were sad, but it didn't spark outrage the way it would do now. Another factor is that in those days, danger was considered part and parcel of the sport. It was part of the appeal of the sport. It was what made the sport special and distinguished it from stick and ball sports like baseball, football, and basketball. This was a philosophy that was adopted not just by fans and journalists, but by many of the drivers themselves. So that needs to be accounted for. Third factor was politics. In those days, the hierarchy of racing was very strictly delineated. At the top of the totem pole were the blue bloods, the aristocratic members of the old boy network who ran the national sporting clubs. These were the people who made up the directors of the CSI, which was the competition arm of the FIA back then. And they put on the races that made up the Formula One schedule. The middle class was represented by constructors and vendors, guys like Mike Hewlin and Colin Chapman. And they were, the equivalent of the shopkeepers, the small shopkeepers or entrepreneurs of the day. Clever guys, to be sure, but, involved in the grubby endeavor of making a living. The drivers were a level below them, and they were analogous, I guess, to plumbers and electricians. They were people with special skills, and they were compensated for them. In the case of superstars like Sterling Moss and Jimmy Clark, they were compensated very well. But by and large, they were considered to be interchangeable cogs in the machine. And when it came to safety, the aristocrats who ran the sport didn't see a moral case for safety. And as a practical matter, they realized it would cost a small fortune, well, actually a large fortune, to line racetracks with miles of guardrails, to equip and train firefighters, and to hire medical staff and outfit hospitals. I mean, this would cost a lot of money, and there wasn't a lot of money in racing in those days. There's no real big-time sponsorship before lucrative television contracts. So the money was going to come out of their pockets, and they had no intention of spending it to keep a couple of drivers from getting killed. The constructors didn't object to safety per se, but for them, as a practical matter, making cars safer would take time. It would cost money, probably add weight. Added weight means slower lap times, and slower lap times is exactly what you don't want if you're a constructor. So as far as they were concerned, the only way they were going to implement any sort of safety upgrades into their cars is if it was required by the regulations. The only group with a vested interest in safety were the drivers, and they were the ones that had no leverage, and so nothing really happened on that front. This can be seen very clearly in the rules that the FIA promulgated regarding safety during this period. I mean, they're so measly as to be almost non-existent. A couple of red letter dates. And so 1952, helmets were required. Good thing. The problem is the only helmets into the 60s, that is, there's glorified paper mache, which had been designed originally for British colonial administrators. And then there were sort of the cork helmets that had been designed for polo players. Phil Hill once said about his helmet that he called his helmet a cardboard hat. The point being that it really didn't do much to protect the driver from head injuries in the case of an accident. 1961, the FIA required roll bars. What they didn't do was require roll bars that were tall enough or robust enough to actually protect the driver in the case of a rollover accident. Pocketful stories about guys making roll bars out of wood and painting them to look like metal. And it's said that Colin Chapman told his mechanics never to push a car around the paddock by the roll bar. The point being that they were so flimsy as to really not be worth what they weighed. 1963, the FIA required fire retardant uniforms. And again, this sounds like another step in the right direction, except for the inconvenient fact that Nomex wasn't yet commercially available and there was no fire retardant material out there for drivers to use. Well, there was actually an aluminized things that firefighters were aware of, but this was not practical for drivers. So they wore the normal cotton uniforms, and what they would do is they would soak it in a solution of boric acid, which supposedly added a couple of seconds of flame protection. Basically, these suits were as valuable in a fire as the helmets were in the case of a crash. And in 1964, the FIA promulgated regulations governing the installation of seatbelts. Again, a good thing. Unfortunately, what they didn't do was require seatbelts. So as a result, nobody installed seatbelts. The first team to show up with seatbelts was the Scarab operation out of Southern California. This was an all-American team. And the reason why they had seatbelts is they drew their inspiration not from Formula One, but from Indy cars, where everyone was already using seatbelts. Scarabs looked beautiful, but they were dog slow. And when they debuted at Monaco, they were so far off the pace that Reventlow asked Sterling Moss if he would take a spin in the car and see if he could figure out what the problem was. Moss agreed, and he gets over to the car, he looks in the cockpit, sees the seatbelts, and what does he do? Doesn't put them on. He sits on top of them, and he goes down. And this was very much par for the course back in the day. In Formula One, that is. Now, it isn't as if people didn't understand what seatbelts were. They'd been around supposedly since the middle of the 19th century when they were used on gliders. And in 1911, when the Wright brothers delivered one of their first airplanes to the U.S. Army, it was equipped with a leather restraint. By 1928, all American planes had to be equipped with seatbelts. And during World War II, all American combat pilots wore 4-point harnesses, so 2 lap belts, 2 shoulder belts. Took a little while for seatbelts to get to the car world. Nash was the first manufacturer to offer seatbelts as an option. This is 1949. And in 1951, seatbelts became available as an aftermarket item. But the real red letter date for seatbelts is 1959. And that's when Niels Boland, who was the chief safety engineer at Volvo, patented the 3-point seatbelt. This almost immediately became the industry standard. And in 1968, 3-point seatbelts were required on all American passenger cars. Racers took a little longer to get with the program, so to speak. Supposedly, Barney Oldfield put seatbelts on a race car in 1922. That's what I've read. Can't really find any confirmation of that. And by that point, Barney would have been pretty old and long in the tooth, so I'm not sure what sort of race car he would have been racing back then. But after World War II, seatbelts became commonplace. War surplus harnesses were available, and they were bought up and used by drivers in Indy cars and sprint cars, midgets, stock cars, dragsters. 1954, the SCCA required seatbelts in all of its cars competing in races, and that included even the puniest Sprites and Crosley hotshots. So by the 1960s, basically every serious driver in the United States would be using a seatbelt. Not so over in Europe. In fact, well into the 60s, most road racers in Europe thought that seatbelts were dangerous rather than a benefit. Conventional wisdom was that given the opportunity, you were supposed to jump out of the cockpit before an accident, more or less like a pilot bailing out of a stricken airplane. Richard Atwood, who won Le Mans 1971 and Porsche 917, told me, "We all knew the cars would deform in the case of a crash. That's why belts weren't really thought of as being a particularly good idea, especially if the car caught fire." Well, the most accomplished practitioner of bailing out of a race car before an accident was American Master Gregory, who famously leapt out of a Lister Jag at Silverstone in 58, and then he did it again at Goodwood the next year in a Trojero Jaguar. Peter Bryant tells a funny story about Gregory. A couple of years later, before the Tasman series, he was doing a seat fitting with Master Gregory. So they're in the garage, and Gregory's in the cockpit. Everything's kind of low-key, and then all of a sudden, Gregory jumps up, hurls himself out of the cockpit and onto the floor of the garage, and Bryant thinks something's wrong. Maybe the car's on fire. He goes, "What's going on?" Gregory calmly stuck a stick of red licorice in his mouth and drawled, "Don't worry, I always check out the escape route when I drive a different car." Now, as you might imagine, a lot of unbelted drivers flew out of their cars unintentionally over in Europe. Probably the most famous incident, you may have seen this photo, a pretty well-known photo of Hans Hermann watching his BRM barrel roll at Aarhus after he's been ejected from the cockpit. Now, fortunately, Herman wasn't hurt in this accident, but this was very much the exception rather than the rule. Moss learned this lesson the hard way a couple of months after testing the Scarab at Monaco, was thrown out of the cockpit of his Lotus at Spa, grievously injured. At Rennes in 1964, Team Lotus driver Peter Rundle's career ended when he was thrown out of the cockpit, and Jean-Pierre Beltois suffered permanent injuries to his left arm. 1965, John Surtees, motorcycle champion, broke his pelvis and several other bones when he was half thrown out of the cockpit of his Lola T70 at Mosport. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And Lucky Kastner, who wasn't wearing a seatbelt, was killed a couple of months later during the Le Mans test. Kastner was actually driving a Maserati coupe, so he was thrown out of the cockpit of a closed cockpit car, which gives you some idea of the forces that were involved in these crashes. The stories of how seatbelts finally came to Formula One has rarely been told, and it stars an unlikely and largely unknown hero in the name of a young British physician, Dr. Michael Henderson. He was a hardcore racing fan. While he was in medical school, he worked as a track announcer, and he wrote freelance articles for car magazines. In 1960, he managed to go club racing in a Lotus 7 that he cadged out of Colin Chapman. When he earned his medical degree, he went to work for the Royal Air Force, study in aviation medicine area. And when he started doing that, he made a surprising discovery. He realized that the aviation industry had been studying high-speed accidents for decades. And in fact, they had all sorts of protocols for how to minimize accidents that resulted from high-speed crashes. And as he told me, I began to understand that there was a science of vehicle safety out there, that we didn't have to ignore the fact that people are getting injured in racing accidents any more than you would ignore any other kind of malady or illness. The aviation medicine textbook that we were using at the time was about 3 inches thick. It was a major book, and yet nothing had been done to adopt any of this material, psychological, physiological, impact resistance, anything, to motor racing. Henderson was no dummy, so he decided to apply some of what he learned to his own racing. When he ran a touring car at the Nürburgring, he fitted it with a 3-point belt, and he did the same thing with his street car, which was a Jaguar XK120. 1966, he bought a Malik U2 Clubman, and his plan was to put in a 4-point harness like the ones used by RAF pilots he worked with. But he realized pretty quickly that the lay-down seating position, which is very similar to a Formula car, meant that in the case of a frontal collision, he would slide under the belts. It was a submarine under them, and he could be grievously injured. So as fate would have it, he had trained as a parachuter, and it struck him that the crotch restraint in a military parachute might be able to be adapted to a 4-point harness to provide anti-submarine protection. So he went to a company called Britax, which was then in the seatbelt business. It's now in the car seat business. And he convinced them to build a harness to his specifications, straps looped around his thighs, to provide the anti-submarine protection. And this created the first 6-point harness used in road racing competition. Angels should have been singing and trumpets blaring. Instead, there was silence. So to drum up some publicity, Henderson wrote a couple of articles, and these generated nothing more than polite indifference. So he now embarked on Plan C. And he contacted various British racing organizations, and he persuaded them to agree to send him information on all the accidents that occurred in the upcoming season. His idea was to collect all this data, kind of crunch it, and then write a book about his findings. That's exactly what he did. Wrote the book in 1967, published it in 1968. Motor Racing and Safety is the foundational text of the motorsport safety movement. Drawing on his analysis of more than 200 accidents, Henderson comprehensively demolished the myth that it made sense to jump out of a moving race car, and he made the affirmative case for wearing a seatbelt. To add gravitas to his thesis, and also to get more people to buy his book, he decided to get a luminary in the motorsports world, to write the foreword. And he approached Lewis Stanley, who ran the Formula One team. And Stanley was a somewhat controversial figure, always dressed in blue blazers and gray flannel slacks. He was somewhat pompous, could be a bit pretentious. Critics considered him the Colonel Blimp of the motorsports world. On the other hand, he was just about the only member of the aristocrats who ran racing who believed in safety. He had almost single-handedly created the International Grand Prix Medical Service, which provided a well-equipped mobile hospital that went from track to track. Henderson pitches Stanley. Stanley invites him to come to his estate near Cambridge. Henderson shows up, gives him a spiel about seatbelts, and when he gets finished, Stanley goes, "Right, I agree. I'll put belts in Jackie Stewart's car." And by this time, Henderson was dissatisfied with the locking mechanism that Britax was using for the 6-point harness. As fate would have it, he was working on a program at the time to upgrade the seatbelts in the F4 Phantoms that the RAF was buying from McDonnell Douglas. This had put him in touch with the GQ parachute company, which had provided all the parachutes used by the RAF during the Second World War. Henderson asked GQ if they might create the 6-point harness for him, and they advised him to get in touch with their chief consultant, Major Terence Willens. Now, Willens is a truly remarkable character, not so much for his racing stuff, but just for his entire career. Orphaned at 13, he worked as a Bronco buster as a teenager while he was still in his teens. When World War II erupted, he volunteered for the British Cavalry and trained as a paratrooper. Before his first jump, his instructor yelled, "Uncurl your ears, Dumbo, and fly." Dumbo Willens he was for the rest of his life. He served as a so-called pathfinder during the war, landing behind enemy lines in France, Greece, and Italy. After the war, he performed a series of incredibly risky high-altitude tests and eventually became known as the father of British sport parachuting. He performed the first live-fire ejection seat tests of the Foland Net jet fighter. He wing-walked without a parachute at air shows, and he also worked as a motion picture stuntman. So Willens and Henderson collaborated to create the 6-point harness that GQ then manufactured and made available to Formula One drivers at the start of the '68 season. Several of them had read Henderson's book, and they were what I guess you call seatbelt curious. The major holdout, unfortunately, was the best-known driver in Formula One. That was Jimmy Clark, two-time world champion. Jimmy absolutely refused to wear a belt, Henderson recalls. And this is kind of weird. I don't really understand this because when Clark raced in the Indy 500, he had to wear a belt. It was required by USAC. And so he was wearing seatbelts when he won the 500 in 1965. But he refused to put them in his Formula One car, and he wasn't wearing them in the Formula Two car. He was racing in Hockenheim on April 7th, 1968. This was a dreadful, dreary weekend. It was rainy. Clark's car, his Lotus, had a misfire. He was running mid-pack early in the race. Tire deflated, got into a terrible tank slapper, couldn't control it. Car hit the tree at high speed. He was thrown out of the cockpit. His head slammed against the trunk of the tree about 10 to 12 feet up, killed instantly. This was very much a come-to-Jesus moment for Clark's colleagues. Chris Amon, who was the number one driver in the Ferrari team, said, speaking for many of his colleagues, "Jimmy's death was the most profound thing that had happened to me in my racing career, because I felt if it could happen to him, what chance did the rest of us have?" I have to confess, I don't think seatbelts would have saved Jimmy Clark at Hockenheim. The accident was just too violent. On the other hand, drivers didn't have access to any other sort of driver equipment. I mean, it was either seatbelts or it was nothing. So during the course of the '68 season, most drivers adopted and started wearing seatbelts. And as Henderson told me, it confirmed my belief that human beings are sentient creatures. If given the right information, they understand that there are reasonable things to do. Anyway, interest in seatbelts naturally filtered down to less exalted forms of racing. John Fenning was an early convert. He had been one of the more successful British Formula 3 drivers early in the '60s before retiring. In 1968, he wanted to get back into racing on an amateur basis, do some hill climbing, and his wife agreed to allow him to do so only if he invested in the latest in safety gear. So he bought a Nomex suit, which was available by then. He bought a full-face helmet, which was available by then. And he wanted to buy some seatbelts, but it wasn't like you could go to Pegasus or your local race shop and pick up a pair of racing belts. They weren't available. So the only guy he knew who was wearing seatbelts was his old F3 rival, Jackie Stewart. So Fenning called BRM, found out who his supplier was. They put him in touch with GQ, and GQ put him in touch with Dumbo Willens. Willens met with Fenning when he was in the area performing some ejection seat tests. Fenning bought a 4-point harness and installed it in his hill climb car. Fenning had a race shop. That's what he did for a living. And so people would come over and they would look at his car and they'd look inside the cockpit and go, "Hey, what's that stuff?" "They're seatbelts." And a couple of people said, "Well, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Maybe I should be wearing seatbelts." So Fenning started selling seatbelts. And after about 6 months, he went to Willens and said, "Dumbo, did you ever think of doing this professionally and stop trying to kill yourself jumping out of airplanes?" I cajoled him into forming a company. He was the brains and I was the salesman. So Willens Harness Manufacturing Limited became the first major player in the racing market, and its signature royal blue belts could be seen in virtually every F1 car of the era. You can still see a lot. I mean, Willens is still in business, and you can still see a lot of them today. It's their favorites in restored F1 cars that are vintage racing, especially cars of the DFE era. Very, very popular and very good. By this time, ironically, Dr. Henderson had sort of gotten out of the seatbelt business. Well, he was never really in the business, but he sort of got out of that world. He moved to Australia and embarked on a new and fruitful career in road car safety. And he eventually served as director of traffic safety in New South Wales. But he kept in touch with his old racing pals. And so in January '69, Formula One drivers, several of them came over to race in the Tasman series in Australia. He had dinner with Jochen Rindt. Rindt was a hard-nosed Austrian who'd more or less taken Clark's place as the number one driver on the Lotus team. And after Jimmy Clark, he was probably the most vocal advocate for safety during this era. He was a big believer in what Henderson was preaching, and he told Henderson, "I've read your book and I agree with everything you say, but you will never get me wearing crotch belts." Rindt believed that in the case of an accident, the thigh belts, the crotch belts, would crush his private parts, which would be very painful if, in fact, that was the case. But Henderson explained that's not the way they work, but Rindt couldn't be convinced. And so he continued to race with a 4-point harness, did not have the crotch belts with anti-submarine protection. Fast forward to September 5th, 1970, practice for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Rindt coming off 4 consecutive victories in the summer in the groundbreaking Lotus 72. There at Monza in practice, he had just blown past Denny Hume at about 190 miles an hour. And in the brake zone for the Parabolica, his car suddenly veered to the left and ran into a guardrail. Had the guardrail been installed properly, it wouldn't have been a terrible accident. Well, it might have been a bad accident, but it wouldn't have been a fatal accident, that's for sure. Unfortunately, the guardrail was not installed properly. The bottom strand gave way. The wedge nose of the Lotus 72 dug in underneath it, and it came to an immediate stop. Rindt was thrust forward in the cockpit, and since he wasn't wearing a submarine belt, he slid forward, and the belt buckle severed his jugular vein. He was dead before medical attention could arrive. Later that year, Rindt became the first driver ever posthumously crowned world driving champion. Despite Rindt's death, the FIA didn't take action to require 6-point harnesses. In fact, they didn't require seatbelts at all, which is a dereliction of duty that's a little hard to understand. I mean, you didn't have to be a safety advocate to understand seatbelts made a lot of sense. 1969, British privateer John Wolfe was killed on the first lap of the 24 Hours of Le Mans when he crashed without wearing seatbelts in his Porsche 917. A week before Rindt was killed at Monza, British amateur Chris Summers, who wore street clothes when he raced and refused to wear a harness, died when he was thrown from the cockpit of his Lola T172 in a Formula 5000 race at Snetterton. Almost exactly a year later, his friend and fellow 5000 racer Peter Houghton, who likewise wore street clothes when he raced and didn't wear seatbelts, died when he was ejected from the cockpit of his Cooper T90 at Oulton Park. It wasn't until 1972 that the FIA finally, belatedly mandated 6-point harnesses, long after the vast majority of Formula cars were already outfitted with them. How many drivers have been badly hurt or killed needlessly before action was taken? Too many. The lesson to be learned from the history of seatbelts is clear. If racing was to be made safer, the changes wouldn't come from the top down. They would be forced on the sport from the bottom up by the people whose lives were at risk, which made sense. After all, revolutions are won on the battlefield, not in the boardroom. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Thanks also to Duke Arkensinger, Bob Barr, and the rest of the crew who put on this symposium. Tremendous amount of work goes into a project like this, and they deserve a huge pat on the back. Anyway, thank you very much. Take care.
This episode is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center. Its charter is to collect, share, and preserve the history of motorsports, spanning continents, eras, and race series. The center's collection embodies the speed, drama, and camaraderie of amateur and professional motor racing throughout the world. The center welcomes serious researchers and casual fans alike to share stories of race drivers, race series, and race cars captured on their shelves and walls and brought to life through a regular calendar of public lectures and special events. To learn more about the center, visit www.racingarchives.org. This episode is also brought to you by the Society of Automotive Historians. They encourage research into any aspect of automotive history. The SAH actively supports the compilation and preservation of papers, organizational records, print ephemera, and images to safeguard, as well as to broaden and deepen the understanding of motorized wheeled land transportation through the modern age and into the future. For more information about the SAH, visit www.autohistory.org.
We hope you enjoyed another awesome episode of Break Fix Podcast, brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved, be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Grand Touring Motorsports. And if you'd like to learn more about the content of this episode, be sure to check out the follow-on article at gtmotorsports.org. We remain a commercial-free and no annual fees organization through our sponsors, but also through the generous support of our fans, families, and friends through Patreon. For as little as $2.50 a month, you can get access to more behind-the-scenes action, additional pit stop minisodes, and other VIP goodies, as well as keeping our team of creators fed on their strict diet of Fig Newtons, Gummy Bears, and Monster. So consider signing up for Patreon today at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. And remember, without you, none of this would be possible.